Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting gently backward in time. So if you're listening in bed or on a long train ride or just staring at the ceiling wondering why your brain won't switch off, go ahead and settle in. Dim the lights, loosen your jaw, let your thoughts slow down. Because tonight we're talking about royalty. Not the glamorous kind from paintings and fairy tales, but the quiet aftermath. The part that usually happens after the castle gates fall, the banners are torn down, and the victorious army gets bored. We're talking about royal women, queens, princesses, duchesses, women who were born believing the world existed for them, and then discovered, very abruptly, that it did not. So let's begin, softly, as history tends to do when it's done shouting. When a kingdom was conquered, the fate of its king was often clear. He would be killed, or imprisoned, or paraded around for a bit, and then killed. Efficiency was appreciated, but royal women were complicated. They were valuable, but inconvenient, dangerous, but also useful, and so their lives tended not to end quickly. Instead, they drifted into something much quieter, much longer, and often much worse. Let's imagine the moment after defeat. The city has fallen. The palace doors are smashed open. Someone is yelling in a language you don't speak. Your crown is gone. Your attendants have vanished. Your husband is either dead, captured, or making a very brave attempt to negotiate while bleeding. And you, the queen, are still alive. Which sounds fortunate. But history has a habit of turning survival into a prolonged inconvenience. Most conquered royal women fell into one of four broad categories: the prisoner, the bargaining chip, the unwanted guest, or the forgotten woman. We'll drift through each of these tonight. Slowly, let's start with the prisoner. For a conquered queen, imprisonment was rarely a dungeon in the dramatic sense. No chains, no rats, no torchlit walls dripping with water. That would have been too theatrical. Instead, she would be placed somewhere safe. A castle room, a monastery, a distant estate. Somewhere she could be watched, always watched. She would keep her title in name only. She might still be called Your Grace. But the grace had clearly moved out. These women were kept alive because killing them caused problems. Dead queens inspired rebellions. Living queens inspired paperwork. As long as she was breathing, the conqueror could say, "See, we are merciful." Mercy, of course, being defined as not murdering someone today. Many of these imprisoned queens lived long, narrow lives. Their days became very small. Meals at the same time, walks in the same courtyard, letters heavily edited, if delivered at all. Their greatest crime was memory, because as long as they remembered who they were dangerous, a living symbol of a lost kingdom. Naturally, their captors tried to help them forget, sometimes by isolating them, sometimes by marrying them off, sometimes by sending them somewhere religious, because monasteries were history's way of putting women on mute. Which brings us to option 2, the bargaining chip. Royal women were, above all else, useful. A captured princess could secure peace. A widowed queen could legitimize a conquest. A teenage daughter could be married to a man twice her age, because diplomacy has never cared much about birthdays. These women were passed around like very expensive apologies. You may have your daughter back, if you recognize me as king. You may keep your title, if you marry my cousin. You may live comfortably, if you never speak to your former subjects again. Comfort, in this case, was a carefully controlled illusion. Some royal women accepted these deals because they had no real alternative. Others accepted them because refusal tended to shorten lives. And a few, very few, learned to manipulate the situation. They became quiet diplomats, survivors, experts in saying just enough and never too much. But most of them simply adapted. They learned new languages, new customs, new ways of pretending they belonged somewhere they absolutely did not. Imagine sitting at a banquet hosted by the man who destroyed your homeland, smiling politely, thanking him for the wine, and knowing that your survival depends on how convincing your gratitude appears. Sleep comes easily when you stop expecting dignity. Now let's drift toward the unwanted guest. Some royal women were too old to marry, too connected to execute, too inconvenient to fully imprison. So they were allowed to live nearby, in a lesser castle, a reduced household, a budget that shrank every year. They became historical furniture, present but ignored, addressed but not consulted, respected in the way one respects a faded tapestry. These women often spent decades in polite exile. They hosted small courts of equally forgotten nobles. They wrote letters no one answered. They waited. For what exactly was never clear. Sometimes they waited for death, sometimes for a miracle, sometimes simply for the day to end. History rarely remembers them because nothing dramatic happened, and history, like most people, prefers drama. But this slow erasure was one of the most common outcomes. The world moved on, and they did not. Then there is the last category, the forgotten woman. These were royal women who disappeared entirely from records, not executed, not imprisoned in famous towers, just gone. Sometimes they were quietly absorbed into lesser nobility. Sometimes they married minor lords. Sometimes they entered religious life under a different name. And sometimes we genuinely don't know. Their existence survives only in footnotes. A line that reads, "She was last mentioned in the year," and then silence, which might be the most unsettling fate of all. Because at least prisoners were acknowledged. Forgotten women were erased while breathing. And this erasure happened not because they were weak, but because they were no longer useful. Now let's talk about something especially uncomfortable. Royal women were often blamed for the fall of their kingdoms, even when they had no actual power. A queen who failed to produce an heir, a princess whose marriage alliance didn't work, a regent who was too emotional, which usually meant she disagreed with someone louder. After conquest, these narratives hardened. She brought this upon us. She tempted fate. She was cursed. Convenient stories, really. Much easier than admitting a kingdom lost a war because of bad decisions made by men with swords. So these women lived under quiet moral judgment, even in captivity. Even in exile, they became symbols of failure rather than victims of it. Which brings us to something rarely discussed. Many conquered royal women suffered profound grief that history barely acknowledges. They lost children, siblings, homes, languages, identities, and they were expected to be calm about it, to be graceful, to accept God's will, to thank their captors for kindnesses that amounted to basic survival. Public mourning was discouraged. Private mourning was tolerated, as long as it was silent. Crying too much was suspicious. Crying too little was cold. There was no correct way to grieve the loss of a kingdom, only incorrect ones. And so many of these women learned to turn inward. They prayed, they embroidered, they wrote. They stared out of windows for years at a time. History calls this passivity, but in truth, it was endurance. One breath after another, one day after another, and in a strange way, that endurance terrified their captors more than rebellion ever could, because a woman who survives everything is hard to control. So what really happened to royal women after conquest? They were not swept away in dramatic finales. They were absorbed, contained, quieted. Their lives became smaller, slower, and deeply constrained. They lived long enough to be inconvenient reminders, and long enough to be forgotten, which is why their stories feel so strangely modern, because power still falls, wars still end, and women are still expected to adapt gracefully to disasters they did not cause. So as we drift onward tonight, away from the battlefield and deeper into the bedrooms, nurseries, and cloisters of history, we'll continue meeting these figures, not as legends, not as villains, but as tired human beings navigating the long, unglamorous aftermath of collapse. Let's drift now to the children born into these broken dynasties, sickly, overprotected, and already doomed by bloodlines that refuse to let go of themselves. But for now, just rest. Let's ease back in. No sudden movements, no trumpets, just history, unfolding at a very reasonable bedtime pace. If you've settled a little deeper into your pillow since last time, that's perfect. Tonight, we're staying close to those conquered courts, but we're lowering our gaze. Because when kingdoms fell, it wasn't just queens who survived the aftermath. There were children, and royal children, as it turns out, were uniquely ill-prepared for reality. They were born into palaces designed to convince them that nothing bad could ever happen. Servants appeared when they cried. Food arrived without effort. Every discomfort was someone else's failure. And then one day, the banners changed. The guards wore different colors. Their tutors vanished. Their names became liabilities. And the child learned, very slowly, that crowns are not inherited so much as borrowed. Royal children of conquered dynasties were rarely killed outright. That would have been crude, messy, and politically inconvenient. Instead, they were reshaped. Let's imagine a young prince, 8 years old, raised to believe he was chosen by God, taught to walk before common children, given a tiny sword and told the world would someday kneel. After conquest, that sword is taken away, not dramatically, just quietly removed from the room. He is told he will be educated elsewhere, somewhere safer, somewhere calmer, which is always how history phrases exile. These children were often separated from their mothers first, because a mother remembers. And memory, again, was dangerous. Placed in foreign courts, they were raised alongside the conqueror's children, dressed similarly, educated similarly, but never quite equally. They were watched for signs of pride, corrected when they spoke of my kingdom, praised when they forgot. Some adapted beautifully. They learned new languages, new loyalties. They laughed at the right jokes. They married into the winning side. History calls these success stories. Others did not. Some children clung desperately to their lost identity. They asked inconvenient questions. They remembered songs. They corrected people who used the wrong titles. These children tended to have shorter, quieter lives, because nothing unsettles a new regime like a child who refuses to forget. Now let's talk about health, because royal bloodlines were already fragile long before conquest complicated things. Generations of intermarriage had produced children who were delicate, small, sickly, prone to fainting, seizures, strange rashes, unexplained fevers. In stable kingdoms, this was managed with optimism and denial. Doctors prescribed prayers. Astrologers blamed planets. Everyone agreed the child would grow out of it. After conquest, however, patience wore thin. A weak royal child was no longer a blessing. They were a problem. They could not be paraded. They could not be married off easily. They did not inspire confidence. So these children were often hidden, sent to monasteries, kept indoors, removed from records altogether, not out of cruelty necessarily, but because sickly children disrupted the narrative. And conquerors, like all insecure rulers, cared deeply about narrative. Some royal children were used as living warnings, kept alive, visible, but stripped of power. A former prince might be allowed to attend court as a minor noble, with no lands, no authority, just enough status to be humiliating. Imagine growing up knowing you were born to rule, and now exist to prove someone else's victory. That kind of identity confusion does not resolve itself quietly. Many of these children grew into anxious adults, obsessive, melancholic, deeply religious. Religion, in particular, became a refuge, because if God had chosen them once, maybe he still remembered. Monastic life was often presented as an honor, a calling, a dignified alternative. But for many royal children, it was simply containment, a way to remove them from the political board without drawing blood. Inside monasteries, former princes learned humility. Former princesses learned silence. They copied manuscripts. They tended gardens. They rang bells at hours dictated by someone else's clock. And slowly, their former lives became stories they weren't supposed to tell. Now, not all royal children were imprisoned or hidden. Some were married. Ah yes, marriage. History's favorite solution. Young princesses in particular became tools of reassurance, married to loyal allies, minor lords, sometimes even former enemies. Their bodies became treaties. Consent was assumed unnecessary. Grief was considered irrelevant. They were told this was their duty, which, in royal terms, meant obedience with a pleasant expression. These marriages were rarely happy, often hurried, frequently mismatched. A girl raised to be a queen suddenly found herself managing a household she did not recognize, with a husband who resented her past or feared her future. And yet, she was expected to adapt, smile, produce heirs, never mention where she came from. Some succeeded. They learned to disappear into domesticity. Others remained emotionally stranded, trapped between identities, neither fully royal nor fully free. And then there were the children who became symbols, too young to remember their kingdoms, but old enough for others to remember them. Rebels rallied around their names. Plots formed in whispers. Rumors spread that the true heir still lived. For these children, survival was especially dangerous. They were moved frequently, hidden under aliases, watched constantly. Their education emphasized obedience over confidence, safety over ambition. They were taught, very carefully, not to believe in destiny, because destiny had already been reassigned. Many of them grew up uncertain, cautious, deeply hesitant to act, which history later interpreted as weakness. But hesitation is a rational response when action has always led to disaster. Now let's slow down even further, because childhood, even under normal circumstances, is fragile, and royal childhoods after conquest were anything but normal. Imagine growing up knowing that your family once mattered, but you must never behave as if it still does. Knowing that your name opens doors, but also closes throats. Knowing that affection can turn into suspicion without warning. That kind of awareness settles deep into a person. It makes sleep difficult, trust complicated, joy conditional, which is why so many adult royals from conquered dynasties appear odd, eccentric, withdrawn, excessively polite, unreasonably anxious. They were children who learned too early that safety was temporary. And now, let's address something quieter. Many royal children simply faded. They lived modest lives, married quietly, died young or unremarkably. Their stories were not preserved because nothing about them served power, and power, once again, controls memory. But if we listen closely, history hums with their absence, with children who should have been important, but weren't allowed to be. So when we talk about fallen kingdoms, it's worth remembering this. The conquest did not end when the walls fell. It continued in nurseries, in classrooms, in arranged marriages and silent vows. It continued in children who learned to lower their voices, to shrink their dreams, to survive by becoming forgettable. And perhaps that is the most effective conquest of all. No bloodshed, no rebellion, just time. So let's drift onward now, away from the children, toward the adults they became. Adults shaped by fragile bloodlines, anxious upbringings, and lives spent performing safety. Kings who hesitated, queens who overcorrected, dynasties that collapsed under the weight of their own exhaustion. But for now, just let your thoughts wander. History isn't going anywhere. The boys who once held wooden swords are adults. The girls who were praised for being quiet have learned to be very good at it. They survived, which, in royal history, already puts them ahead of most people. But survival does not mean peace. It means habit. These former royal children grew into adults who had been trained, very carefully, not to expect stability. They woke each morning already alert, already cautious, already aware that comfort was temporary, and that awareness shaped everything. Let's start with the men. Former princes who grew up after conquest often became hesitant rulers, or not rulers at all. Some were allowed to inherit small titles, minor lands, ceremonial roles, nothing dangerous, nothing meaningful. They were kings in theory, clerks in practice. They spoke carefully, moved slowly, apologized often, which later historians described as weakness. But hesitation makes sense when every bold move you witnessed as a child ended in exile, imprisonment, or death. These men learned that ambition attracted attention, and attention was rarely kind, so they became cautious adults, obsessively cautious. They consulted advisors endlessly, delayed decisions, prayed before acting, prayed again after acting. Religion became a kind of insurance policy. If God had once chosen their family, maybe he still felt responsible. And if he didn't, well, at least prayer looked good in public. Some of these men developed strange habits. They counted things, steps, coins, hours. They repeated routines exactly. A way to feel control in a life that had taught them control was imaginary. Others retreated inward. They read constantly, wrote letters no one asked for, collected relics, books, symbols of legitimacy, not to rule the world, but to remind themselves they had once belonged somewhere. Now let's talk about the women, because former royal girls grew into adults carrying a very specific burden. They had been taught early that their bodies were political tools, that silence was safety, that compliance was praised. As adults, they became queens who overcorrected. They smiled too much, apologized too often, tried very hard not to be blamed for anything, because blame, once assigned, never really left. Many became excessively gracious, publicly charitable, almost painfully agreeable, and when they did assert themselves, even gently, it was remembered. She is difficult. She is emotional. She forgets her place, which of course was the same accusation their mothers had faced. So many chose restraint. They governed quietly, influenced privately, learned how to say yes in a way that still meant no. Others turned to religion with equal intensity. Convents were full of former princesses who had grown tired of being watched. tired of being useful, tired of performing gratitude. Inside cloisters, they found something radical: predictability, prayer at fixed hours, meals without politics, a life where silence was no longer suspicious, but expected. Some genuinely believed. Some simply rested. Now, not all survivors became cautious saints. A few reacted in the opposite direction. They became reckless. These were the adults who decided that if safety was an illusion, then caution was pointless. They drank too much, spent wildly, challenged authority openly. They were remembered fondly in stories, bold, charismatic, tragic, and they usually died young. History enjoys these figures because they burn brightly and briefly. It prefers them to the quieter ones who lived long, careful lives doing very little wrong. Now let's pause on something subtle. Many of these adults struggled with identity. They had been born into greatness, raised in humiliation, and released into a world that didn't know what to do with them. They were too royal to be ordinary, too powerless to be royal. So they hovered in between, polite, anxious, never fully relaxed. Sleep was difficult for many of them. Nighttime brought memories, whispers, the sound of banners being changed, doors closing. They dreamed of rooms they were no longer allowed to enter, which is why so many of them appeared strange, eccentric, withdrawn, overly formal, not because they were broken, but because they had learned early that normalcy was unsafe. Now, some of these former royal children simply faded. They married quietly, moved to minor estates, lived lives so unremarkable that historians barely noticed them. They are often described in records as "nothing further is known," which sounds dismissive, but is actually remarkable. Because nothing further means they survived without causing trouble. In a world that punished memory, forgettability was protection. And so conquest finished its work, not with executions, but with time, with marriages, with routines, with lowered expectations. By the time we reach this part of the story, the crowns are back on heads again. There are kings, there are queens, there are courts that look functional from a distance, and yet something is off. Because these rulers did not inherit thriving kingdoms. They inherited habits, fears, unfinished business. They inherited ruins that had learned to stand upright. Many of these adults were technically in power. They signed documents. They issued decrees. They sat on thrones polished to a ceremonial shine. But inside, they ruled cautiously, as if the floor might give way at any moment, which, historically speaking, was a reasonable assumption. These were rulers shaped by conquest, exile, and humiliation. Even if they had not experienced it directly, their parents had, their tutors remembered, the walls remembered, and memory has a way of leaking into governance. Let's start with decision-making, or rather, the lack of it. Many of these kings were famously indecisive. They formed councils for everything, committees for committees, advisory boards that advised other advisory boards, not because they loved bureaucracy, but because making a final decision felt dangerous. Someone, somewhere, might disagree, and disagreement in their family history had consequences. So they delayed. They postponed wars that probably should have been fought. They avoided reforms that desperately needed doing. They compromised constantly. Historians later complained that these rulers lacked vision. But vision requires confidence, and confidence had been systematically removed from their bloodlines. Now let's talk about the courts. On the surface, they were elaborate: silk, gold, ceremony layered on ceremony. But beneath the surface, they were anxious spaces. Everyone watched everyone else. Courtiers whispered. Favorites rose and fell quickly. Trust was temporary, because these rulers knew, deep down, that loyalty was conditional. Their grandparents had learned that lesson the hard way, so they tested people endlessly. They rewarded obedience, punished unpredictability, surrounded themselves with people who agreed with them, which created very calm courts and very poor decisions. Queens in these environments faced a familiar problem. They were expected to stabilize things emotionally, to smile during tense negotiations, to produce heirs quickly, preferably without complications, because nothing frightened a fragile dynasty more than uncertainty about succession. Royal marriages during this period were tense, not dramatic, just deeply uncomfortable. Husbands and wives were partners in anxiety, each aware that their personal failures could become political disasters. Miscarriages were mourned quietly, illnesses hidden. Children watched obsessively for signs of weakness, and weakness, once again, was not tolerated. Now let's slow down and talk about parenting, because these rulers raised children very differently from their ancestors. They did not tell fairy tales about destiny. They told cautionary stories. They taught obedience early, silence early, self-control before curiosity. Royal nurseries became strangely quiet places. Children were corrected gently, but constantly. Praise was measured, affection restrained, because affection creates attachment, and attachment creates vulnerability. These parents believed they were protecting their children, and in a way, they were, but they were also continuing the conquest internally. Many of these rulers developed what we might politely call odd fixations. Some obsessed over genealogy. They traced bloodlines endlessly, desperate to prove legitimacy. Others obsessed over ritual, exact seating arrangements, precise titles, endless repetition of tradition, because tradition felt stable, and stability felt safe. A few became obsessed with morality, public piety, strict codes of behavior, harsh judgment for anyone who stepped out of line. These rulers are often remembered as stern, unforgiving, joyless. But moral rigidity is often just fear wearing formal clothing. Now, not all of them failed. Some managed to rule competently, if quietly. They avoided wars, maintained peace, let their kingdoms exist rather than expand. History rarely celebrates these figures. They didn't conquer. They didn't collapse spectacularly. They simply endured, which in the aftermath of conquest is an achievement. Others, however, collapsed under the weight of expectation. They overreacted to minor threats, crushed dissent early, interpreted disagreement as rebellion, because their internal compass had been calibrated by trauma. To them, everything felt like the beginning of the end, and so they made it so. Now, here's the quiet irony. These rulers were often desperate to appear strong, but strength, as they understood it, was rigidity, no flexibility, no forgiveness, no second chances, which made their kingdoms brittle. And brittle things break, slowly at first, then all at once. By the time these rulers died, many of their dynasties were already exhausted, not defeated, just tired. The bloodlines were thin, the institutions hollow, the people disengaged, and history moved on, as it always does, because conquest doesn't just destroy kingdoms, it reshapes the people who survive it. It teaches caution instead of courage, silence instead of confidence, routine instead of imagination, and those lessons linger. So as we prepare to drift onward toward the final dissolutions, the quiet disappearances, the moments where even memory lets go, remember this: most dynasties do not end with a bang. They end with people trying very hard not to make mistakes, and slowly, running out of energy. But for now, just breathe. All right, let's keep going. Stay with me. No long pauses this time, just a steady, even flow. easy for an AI voice to carry, easy for a tired mind to follow. By the time we reach this stage of the story, something important has changed. There are still crowns, still ceremonies, still official portraits where everyone looks very serious. But the belief is gone, not announced, not declared, just quietly absent. These dynasties are no longer convinced of their own permanence. They exist, but they do not expect to exist forever. And that expectation, or lack of it, shapes everything. The rulers of this phase do not dream loudly. They manage, they maintain, they avoid risks. Their reigns are filled with phrases like holding things together and preventing unrest. No one talks about glory anymore. Glory attracts attention. Attention invites trouble. So these kings and queens become caretakers of decline. They inherit systems already worn thin by fear, caution, and compromise. And instead of rebuilding them, they preserve them exactly as they are, because changing something might break it. They rule by repetition. Same advisors, same rituals, same policies, even when they no longer work. In council meetings, silence is valued more than ideas. Agreement is rewarded more than insight. And slowly, the state becomes very calm, very orderly, and completely exhausted. Now let's talk about public life. On the outside, everything looks stable. Markets open, taxes are collected, festivals still happen, though smaller, quieter. But people feel it. They sense the hesitation at the top. They notice how decisions take too long, how rulers react instead of lead. And when confidence disappears from leadership, it doesn't vanish. It relocates into local powers, into factions, into ambitious nobles who are no longer afraid. Because fear flows downward only as long as belief flows upward, and belief is gone. Queens during this period play a very specific role. They are expected to project continuity, to smile for the dynasty, to reassure everyone that things are normal. They host gatherings, sponsor religious works, pose with children who are carefully presented as healthy and strong. Behind closed doors, they often know better. They see the fragile heirs, the empty treasuries, the advisors quietly positioning themselves for whatever comes next. And yet, they perform optimism, because optimism has become part of the job. Marriage at this stage becomes increasingly desperate, not romantic, not strategic, just necessary. Alliances are rushed, compatibility ignored. Anyone with land, soldiers, or money is considered suitable. These unions produce children who grow up surrounded by expectation, but very little certainty. Once again, childhood becomes cautious. But now there is an added layer: disappointment. Parents are not afraid their children will conquer the world. They are afraid their children will fail to keep what remains. So the pressure is quieter, heavier, and constant. These children are trained to maintain appearances, to avoid scandal, to never draw attention. They are raised to be invisible rulers, which works for a while, until invisibility becomes irrelevance. Now here is where history does something very subtle. It stops recording details, not because nothing is happening, but because nothing is changing. Chronicles become repetitive. Nothing of note occurred this year. The realm remained at peace. Peace, in this case, meaning stagnation. And stagnation is the last stage before replacement. Some rulers sense this. They feel the quiet slipping away. They attempt late reforms, sudden crackdowns, desperate displays of authority. But these actions feel forced, like someone raising their voice in an empty room. Others simply withdraw. They spend more time hunting, more time praying, more time away from court, delegating power to people who are more than happy to take it. And slowly, without rebellion, without drama, the dynasty stops being central. It still exists, but it no longer matters. people stop looking upward for direction. They look sideways, locally, pragmatically. This is how dynasties really end. Not with fire, not with execution, but with indifference. By the time an external force arrives, a rival house, a foreign power, a political shift, the structure is already hollow. It collapses politely, almost gratefully, and the former rulers adapt. They retire to estates, they accept pensions, they become ceremonial figures, or they disappear entirely, marrying into lesser nobility, entering religious life, living out their days quietly. Their names survive sometimes, their power does not. And history moves on without malice, because history is not cruel. It is just efficient. So when we look back at these dynasties, it's tempting to ask when exactly they failed. But that's the wrong question. They didn't fail at one moment. They learned, over generations, how to survive instead of how to rule. And survival, while impressive, is not the same thing as leadership. Conquest taught them caution. Caution became habit. Habit became identity. And identity became destiny. Now let your thoughts keep drifting. We're almost at the end of this long, quiet journey, from crowns to children, from fear to routine, from power to memory. And if your mind starts to wander, that's perfectly fine. These dynasties did the same. History isn't rushing, and neither are we. By now, the dynasties we've been following are barely holding a shape. They still exist on paper. They still have names. But they no longer occupy the center of anyone's imagination. And that matters more than armies ever did. Because power doesn't disappear when it is defeated. It disappears when it is ignored. The rulers of this final phase wake up each morning without urgency. There is no grand threat on the horizon, no rebellion worth dramatizing, no rival bold enough to announce itself loudly. Instead, there is paperwork, routine, small decisions about roads, taxes, and ceremonies that no one attends anymore. These rulers are not cruel, they are not foolish, they are simply tired. And tired systems do not fight collapse, they allow it. Most days in these courts begin quietly. A servant opens shutters. Light enters rooms filled with furniture chosen generations ago. Someone reads reports aloud, slowly, carefully, without emphasis. The ruler listens, nods, approves most things automatically. Not because they don't care, but because caring deeply would require energy they no longer have. This is not decay in the dramatic sense. Nothing is rotting visibly. Nothing is broken beyond use. It is decay in the administrative sense, the most effective kind. Positions are filled, but by people chosen for reliability, not ability. Innovations are discouraged, not by law, but by custom. Anyone who suggests change is met with polite silence. Silence is very powerful. Over time, ambitious people stop speaking. Creative people leave. And what remains is extremely calm, almost peaceful. In these kingdoms, days pass without memorable events, which is why historians struggle to write about them. There are no scandals, no great loves, no great betrayals, just continuity. And continuity, when stretched too long, becomes numbness. Now let's talk about leadership presence. In earlier eras, rulers were seen. They traveled. They appeared in public. They were symbols. In this phase, rulers become distant without intending to, not hidden, just irrelevant. They attend ceremonies because they are scheduled. They sign decrees because they are presented. But no one waits anxiously for their decisions. Life has adjusted around them. Local authorities handle problems. Guilds negotiate among themselves. Religious institutions fill the emotional space power once occupied. The crown remains, but it no longer anchors society. And this is where American audiences, whether they realize it or not, usually drift off. Because nothing explodes, nothing resolves. Things simply continue. And that continuation is deeply soothing. Now consider the personal lives of these final rulers. They are not surrounded by passion. They marry because it is expected. They have children because succession requires it. But the urgency is gone. Children are raised gently, carefully, without grand expectations. No one tells them they will change the world. They are told to behave, to be polite, to avoid mistakes. Mistakes are the only unforgivable thing now. These children grow up cautious but not ambitious. They learn manners before curiosity, compliance before confidence. And so the cycle completes itself, not with trauma anymore, but with inertia. These adults inherit roles that feel ceremonial even to them. They perform them competently, quietly. They do not resist when authority shifts elsewhere. They accommodate. Accommodation is the final skill dynasties master. Now, somewhere far away, another power is rising. It does not announce itself dramatically. It builds quietly, efficiently. By the time it becomes visible, it is already normal. And when it finally replaces the old order, there is surprisingly little resistance. Because resistance requires belief. And belief has been absent for generations. So the transition happens through treaties, through marriages, through legal language that sounds reassuring. Former rulers are compensated. Titles are preserved in name only. Ceremonies continue, but their meanings change, and life goes on, which is perhaps the most unsettling thing history does. It goes on without sentiment. Now pause, not a dramatic pause, just a gentle slowing. Because this is the point where listeners usually start to feel heavy, not emotional, just drowsy. Because nothing terrible is happening. Nothing exciting is happening. The mind relaxes when it realizes it is no longer being tested. This is why stories like this work so well as sleep narratives. They remove urgency. They reassure the brain that nothing needs immediate attention. History here becomes background noise, a long hallway with evenly spaced doors, all closed, none alarming. And as we continue deeper into this final quiet phase, everything becomes smaller. Decisions, ambitions, expectations, even memory begins to soften. Names repeat, dates blur, events lose sharp edges. The dynasty becomes a pattern rather than a story. And patterns are easy to fall asleep to. All right, we're still moving, but very slowly. No sharp turns, no raised voices. Just the steady sound of history doing paperwork. By this point, the dynasty barely notices itself. It exists the way old furniture exists in a house. Always there, rarely questioned, occasionally dusted. People pass by portraits in hallways without stopping. They recognize the faces, vaguely. They know the names, sort of. But there is no emotional pull anymore. And emotional pull is what power feeds on. Without it, authority becomes decorative. In these courts, mornings are predictable, too predictable to be dangerous. The same bell rings. The same servant announces the same schedule. Breakfast is served. Reports are read. Nothing urgent appears. If something does appear urgent, it is softened, rephrased, delayed. Urgency has become impolite, and so problems learn to wait. The ruler listens with an expression perfected over years. Attentive, neutral, calm. They nod at the right moments. Ask safe questions. Questions that do not lead anywhere uncomfortable. Because discomfort suggests change. And change suggests instability. Stability, even shallow stability, is now the highest value. These rulers are not lazy. That's important. They are diligent in very small ways. They sign everything placed before them. They attend required events.